I've spent 40 years around cattle, and I'll tell you the truth, nobody at the auction house wanted to hear that morning. You can measure a man's future by what he's willing to buy when it looks like a mistake. She paid $800. $800 for 40 bison so thin you could hang a hat on their hip bones. The whole yard laughed, not out loud, were not cruel, but in that way ranchers laugh with their eyes and the corners of their mouths, the laugh that says there goes another one who watched too many documentaries. I laughed too. God forgive me, I laughed. I'm telling you this because I was wrong, and being wrong is the only story worth telling. What I watched happen over the next 12 months I still don't fully understand, and I've turned it over every night since. This isn't a story about Bison. It's about a woman who saw something none of us could see and what it cost her to be right. Let me start where it started, with the mud and the auctioneer's voice and the first time I ever heard her name. The rain had been coming down since before dawn, the kind of cold April rain that doesn't fall so much as settle into everything you own. I remember my collar was soaked through, and I hadn't even noticed until I felt it against my neck, that clammy touch that means you've been standing too long thinking about nothing. The Coldwater Livestock Auction sits about 9 miles outside of town, a long metal barn the color of an old nickel, and on sale days the lot fills up with trucks and the particular smell of wet animal and diesel and coffee gone bitter in the thermos. I'd been coming to that lot for 38 years. My father before me for longer than that. You learn a place so well it stops being a place and becomes a kind of clock, marking the seasons of your life. That morning, the pens near the back held the bison, and everybody who wandered past them made the same face. They were a sorry-looking bunch. I won't pretend otherwise. 40 head brought up from an operation down south that had gone under foreclosure, somebody said, though at an auction everybody's got a version of everybody else's ruin. The animals had been neglected in that slow way that isn't quite cruelty but lives right next door to it. Ribs showing, coats matted and dull, patches worn down to hide. A few of them had that low-headed stillness that animals get when they've stopped expecting anything good. One young cow had an eye crusted half shut. A bull calf favored his left front leg so bad he barely put weight on it. Merle Hutchins stood next to me chewing a toothpick down to splinters. "Somebody ought to just put 'em down," he said. "Kinder than sellin' M." I didn't answer. I was watching the woman. She stood apart from the rest of us, over by the rail, not talking to anybody. Small. Maybe 50, maybe older. She had one of those faces that had been out in weather so long you couldn't date it. Gray hair pulled back under a canvas cap gone soft with age. A man's barn coat, too big for her, the cuffs rolled twice. She wasn't looking at the crowd the way buyers do, sizing up their competition. She was looking at the animals, just looking. Her hands were folded on the top rail and her chin rested on them, and she watched those bison the way you'd watch something you already loved and were only now getting to meet. I didn't think much of it then. Auctions draw all kinds. Hobby folks, dreamers, people who have read a book and decided the land is calling them home. You learn to spot the ones who won't last past their first hard winter. The auctioneer, a heavyset fellow named Del Prewitt, worked the cattle first because that's where the money was. Good Angus stock moving at fair prices. Nothing remarkable, the ordinary commerce of the thing. Men bidding with a lifted finger or a tug of the hat brim, small motions that carried whole conversations. I bought 9 head myself that day, replacement heifers, and paid about what I expected to pay. Then Del got to the bison, and you could feel the room let go of its attention. Folks started drifting toward the doors, toward the concession window, toward their trucks. The bison were an afterthought, a lot nobody had come for. "Now here's something different," Del said, and even his voice had gone half-hearted. 40 head of bison, cows, and a couple young bulls sold as one lot, as is. Gonna need some care, I'll be honest with you. Who'll start me at 1,500 for the bunch? Silence, the rain drumming the metal roof. 1,200 then? Somebody's got room for a project. Nothing, somebody laughed near the door. All right, 1,000. 40 head for $1,000, that's 25 a head, folks. You can't hardly buy a decent dog for that. 800. The whole barn turned. It was her. She hadn't raised her hand or her voice. She just said it plain, the way you'd tell somebody the time. Del squinted at her. 800 from the lady at the rail. I got 8 who'll gimme 9, come on now. He was going through the motions. Everybody knew there wasn't a 9 coming. There wasn't even really an 8 from anybody else. 800 going once, going twice. He slapped the rail. Sold to the lady in the back. God bless you, ma'am, and good luck to you. That last part he meant as a joke, and it got its laugh. She didn't seem to hear it, or if she did, it slid off her like the rain off the roof. I watched her walk up to settle the paperwork, and I did the thing I'm not proud of. I said something to Merle. I said, 40 ways to lose $800. And Merle laughed, and a couple other men laughed, and we all felt the small, warm comfort of being the ones who knew better. Her name, I learned from the clipboard when I signed out my own stock, was Ruth Amara Delgado. She trailered in from a place I didn't recognize, some section of land up in the broken country to the northwest, where the good grass gives out and the ranchers thin out with it. Hard land up there, land that takes more than it gives. I figured I'd never see her again. Most of them you don't. I was wrong about that in about 4 days, because that's when the trouble with her bison became everybody's business. See, one of those cows died in the trailer or right after, the one with the bad eye, I heard. And word travels in a county like ours the way fire travels in dry grass. By the weekend, it was all over the co-op and the feed store that the crazy woman who bought the starving buffalo had already lost one, and probably would lose the lot, and wasn't it a shame, and wasn't it exactly what everybody figured? There's a cruelty in a small place that dresses itself up as concern. I've been guilty of it. We all cluck our tongues about a neighbor's misfortune while some part of us, some low part we don't look at directly, feels satisfied. Because if she fails, then the rest of us were right not to try. Her failure protects us from the question of whether we lack the nerve to do a hard, foolish, beautiful thing. I want to be honest about that because it matters for what comes later. The feed store is where I heard the rest of it, from Cyrus, who runs the counter and knows everything about everyone, whether it's true or not. He told me Ruth Delgado had shown up Tuesday and bought a load of alfalfa and some mineral supplement and a mess of fencing supplies, and paid cash from a roll she kept in her coat, and hadn't said more than 10 words the whole time. Cyrus said she'd asked one question. She'd asked whether the native grass up in her country, she named the section, still carried the old bunch grasses, or whether it had all gone over to cheatgrass and the invaders. Odd thing to ask, Cyrus said. Who cares what kind of weeds are on the place? Grass is grass. But I thought about it on the drive home. Grass isn't grass. Any rancher who's paid attention knows that, even if he can't say why in words a scientist would like. The old grasses, the ones that were here before we plowed and grazed and burned everything into a new shape, they're built different, deeper roots. They hold the soil, hold the water, come back after drought when the shallow stuff has burned off brown and dead. My grandfather used to talk about the grass his grandfather described. Grass that brushed a horse's belly, and how it was mostly gone now, replaced by tougher, thirstier, poorer stuff. I didn't know yet why a woman with 40 half-dead bison was asking about bunchgrass, but it stuck with me, a little burr caught in the sock of my mind. Curiosity is a failing of mine. My late wife used to say I'd follow a strange dog 3 counties over just to find out whose it was. So maybe 3 weeks after the auction, when I had a free afternoon, and a reason to be driving up that direction anyway, checking on a stretch of fence I leased grazing on, I took the long way around and drove up into the broken country to see what had become of the crazy woman and her buffalo. The road up there is bad. Gravel that gives out to dirt, dirt that gives out to 2 ruts and a prayer. The land changes as you climb, gets rougher and lonelier, the ranch is farther apart and harder used. It's beautiful in a way that doesn't care whether you find it beautiful. Big broken hills, rock outcrops, draws full of juniper and the silver green of sage. Country that was never meant for row crops and barely tolerates cattle. I found her place by the mailbox, which had DLGADO painted on it in careful hand lettering, the paint still fresh. A long drive down to a set of buildings that had seen better decades. A house, a barn with a sway in its spine, some outbuildings, all of it weathered gray. But there was work being done. New fence posts, bright and raw, marching along a line. A stretch of new wire. Somebody's sweat all over the place. She was out in the near pasture when I pulled up, and she didn't come to meet me the way most folks would. She just watched me park, watched me get out, a shovel in her hand and dirt on her knees. I felt like an intruder, which I suppose I was. Afternoon, I called. I was at the auction, bought some heifers the same day you bought your, I gestured vaguely at the pasture, your bison. I remember you, she said. Something in the way she said it told me she'd heard me laughing, told me she remembered that about me specifically. I felt my face go hot. I was just passing, I said, which was mostly a lie. Wanted to see how they were getting on. She looked at me a long moment, then something in her softened, not much, but enough. "Come look then," she said, "since you came all this way to be curious." I followed her out to the fence line, and I'll tell you the bison looked better. Not good, not yet, but better. 3 weeks of decent feed and clean water and being left alone had taken the worst edge off them. They'd lifted their heads. A couple of the younger ones had that shine coming back into their coats. The limping bull calf still limped but put more weight down now. They watched us with those big dark ancient eyes, wary but not defeated. "They're coming around," I admitted. "They're doing the coming around," she said. "I'm just getting out of their way." I didn't know what to make of that. She leaned on the fence and looked at them the same way she'd looked at them in the auction pen, that look of loving something before you know it. And because I'm the kind of fool who can't stand a silence, I asked her the question everybody in the county wanted to ask. "Why'd you buy 'em, Ruth? If you don't mind my asking, 40 sick buffalo on land this hard. Folks are saying," I stopped. "I know what folks are saying." She wasn't angry. She said it the way you'd note the weather. "They're saying I'll lose the lot and it serves me right for being foolish." She turned and looked at me and her eyes were the clearest gray, sharp and unhurried. "You want to know why I bought them? All right. But you'll have to hear the whole thing, and it's long, and you look like a man with somewhere to be." "I've got time," I said, and found that I meant it. She was quiet a while. Somewhere off in the draw, a meadowlark was working through its song. That liquid falling tumble of notes that means spring is really here no matter what the morning rain wants you to believe. "My grandmother's people ran bison on this country," Ruth said finally. "Before it was called this country, before it was called anything you'd find on a map." She said it plainly, no drama in it. "My grandfather's people came later from somewhere else and married in and stayed. I've got both those bloodlines, and this piece of ground is what's left to me of all of it. 200 acres of the hardest, poorest, most broke-down land in this whole county." She toed the dirt with her boot. "My husband ran cattle on it. 40 years we ran cattle on it, and every year the grass got a little thinner and the soil got a little harder and the water sat a little worse, and every year it took a little more money. We didn't have to keep the same number of head we'd always run. And every year the county experts and the feed men and the neighbors told us the same thing. Run more cattle, buy more feed, push harder, fix the land with money." She shook her head slowly. "He died still believing it was his fault, still believing if he just worked a little harder the land would have turned around. It broke him. It broke him before it killed him." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. "After he passed, I sat on this porch for 2 years and watched the land die," she went on. "Watched it turn to weeds and bare dirt, and I got to reading. I'm not an educated woman by any school's reckoning, but I can read, and I read everything I could find about this land and what it used to be and why it stopped being that. And it kept coming back to one thing." She nodded out at the bison. "Them, or animals like them. The land didn't evolve alongside cows, mister. It evolved alongside the buffalo, millions of years of it. The grass, the soil, the water, the birds, the bugs, all of it grew up dancing with the buffalo, and we came in and took the buffalo out and put cows in and wondered why the whole thing started falling apart." "They're both just grazing animals," I said. "Cow, buffalo, I don't see the—" "That's what everybody says," a ghost of a smile. "They graze different, they move different. A cow'll stand in a good spot and eat it down to nothing and foul the water and never move till you make her. A buffalo takes a bite and moves on, keeps moving, doesn't linger, tramples the seed in with those hooves, fertilizes as it goes, then's gone before it does real damage and doesn't come back around till the grass has had its rest. They don't just eat the land, they tend it. They always did. We just forgot how to see it." I looked at those 40 sorry animals with new eyes. "So you're going to what?" I said. "Fix your land with buffalo." "I'm going to get out of the way," she said, "and let the buffalo fix the land. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole thing." I drove home slow that evening, turning it all over. Part of me still thought she was a dreamer chasing a beautiful idea into ruin. But another part, a quieter part, had heard something in her voice that I recognized. It was the sound of someone who had stopped hoping and started knowing. And I've lived long enough to be careful around that sound. Sometimes it's madness. But sometimes it isn't. I didn't mean to become part of it. I want that on the record. I was a bystander, a curious neighbor, a man who'd laughed at the auction and felt bad enough about it to drive up a bad road once. That should have been the end of my involvement. But it turned out Ruth Delgado needed a hand with something in June, and I was the only fool who'd offered so. She called me, she'd gotten my number off Cyrus, of all people, and asked in that flat, proud way of hers whether I knew anything about water. Meaning wells, meaning springs, meaning the old buried plumbing of a place. As it happened, I did. My own place had taught me more about failing water systems than I ever wanted to know. So I drove back up into the broken country on a hot, dry morning with the smell of dust already rising off the road, and I gave her a hand. The problem was an old spring that had gone to mud. Somewhere upslope of the house there had once been a good spring. Her husband had developed it decades back, run a pipe down to a stock tank, and it had served the place for years before it slowly quit. She wanted to know if it could be brought back. She wanted the water for the bison, not because they'd die without it, there was a well, but because she said the spring water was better and the land remembered it. The land remembered it. She talked like that sometimes, and I never knew quite what to do with it. We spent the better part of a day up that slope in the heat, digging out the old spring box, clearing the pipe, chasing the trickle back to its source. And while we worked, she talked, and I listened, and I started to understand the shape of what she was attempting. It wasn't just buffalo on the land. It was a whole plan, years long, patient past anything I'd ever had the stomach for. She divided her 200 acres into paddocks with that new fencing, not to keep the bison in so much as to control where they went and when. The whole idea was to let them graze one small piece hard and fast, the way the great herds used to move through a place in a thundering hurry, and then move them off and let that piece rest. Rest for weeks. Rest for months. Rest long enough for the grass to not just recover, but to reach down and build root and pull carbon out of the sky, and put it into the soil where it belonged. Everybody grazes their land to death because they leave the animals in one place too long, she said, wiping her face with a bandana gone brown with dust. The land can take a hard bite. What it can't take is a hard bite every single day forever with no rest. That's what kills it, not the grazing, the never stopping. Sounds like a lot of moving fence, I said. It's the most work I've ever done in my life, she said, and I've done a lot of work. She wasn't lying. I saw it in her hands, which were a wreck, cracked and calloused and swollen at the knuckles. I saw it in the way she moved, careful like a woman managing a body that hurt her. She was out there every day alone in her 60s, moving those animals and that fence, and hauling that water and mending everything that broke, which on a place that old was everything. There was no husband anymore. No hired man, she couldn't afford one. No children nearby. She mentioned a son once in California in a voice that closed a door. It was her and 40 bison and 200 acres of ruined ground and an idea she'd stake her whole life on. We got the spring running again toward evening. Just a trickle at first, then a thin, steady flow, cold and clean, filling the old box and running down the pipe to the tank. She stood and watched the water come, and she put her cracked hand over her mouth, and I saw her eyes go bright. And she turned away so I wouldn't see, and I pretended I hadn't. "Thank you," she said when she'd got herself back. "I couldn't have done that alone." "It was nothing," I said. "It wasn't nothing," she looked at me. "Why'd you come, really? Don't say you were passing. Nobody passes up here." I thought about it honestly, the way she seemed to demand of everyone around her without ever asking. "I laughed at you," I said, "at the auction, and I've been ashamed of it. I guess I wanted to make up for that." She surprised me then. She smiled, a real one that changed her whole face and showed me the young woman she'd been 40 years gone. "Well," she said, "that's the most honest thing anybody's said to me in a year. Come on. I'll feed you before you drive down that road in the dark." That was the summer I got to know Ruth Delgado. Not well. She didn't let anybody all the way in, and I don't think she had it in her anymore to try. But I came up when I could. I told myself it was neighborliness. Really, I think I'd caught something from her, some fever of belief, and I wanted to be near it and see how it came out. By high summer, the bison had transformed. I don't have another word for it. The sorry, starving creatures from the auction pen were gone, replaced by animals that took your breath a little. They'd filled out. Their coats had come in dark and thick and glossy, and they'd started shedding it in great ragged sheets the way they do, rubbing against the fence posts and the lone juniper in the near pasture. The limping bull calf didn't limp anymore. He'd grown into a stocky, insolent thing that would lower his head and paw the dirt when you got too close, all bluff and youth. The cows had that deep-chested power to them, that low center of gravity that makes a bison look less like an animal and more like a piece of the landscape that decided to get up and walk. And the land, that was the part I hadn't believed. Where the bison had grazed and moved on weeks before, the grass had come back thicker than it had any right to. Greener. And I looked closer because I couldn't believe it. There were bunch grasses coming up in it. The old grasses. The deep-rooted native stuff that Ruth said had nearly vanished from the place. It was as though the seed had been lying in that hard ground for years, decades maybe, waiting, and the hooves and the manure and the rest had finally given it what it needed to wake up. "You didn't plant that," I said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Ruth said. "It was always there in the soil, waiting for the conditions to be right again." She ran her hand over the seed heads. "You can't force this. You can only make the conditions and then wait and see what the land has been keeping. It kept more than I dared hope." We stood in that grass a while. The wind moved through it, and it made a sound I hadn't heard on hard-used land in years. That soft, dry, sibilant rush of a lot of grass all leaning together. A living sound. "I wish he'd lived to see it," Ruth said quietly, and I knew she meant her husband. "He'd have thought it was witchcraft. He worked so hard. He worked himself into the grave trying to save this place the wrong way, and all it needed was—" her voice caught. "All it ever needed was for somebody to bring the buffalo home and then have the sense to stand back." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. Have the sense to stand back. We are not a people who stand back. Everything in us wants to push, to force, to solve, to do. It takes a rare kind of courage to do the hardest work of your life and have that work be, in the end, a kind of stepping aside. To labor with all your strength to let something else become what it already knew how to be. Not everything went easy. I'd be lying to you if I painted it as a clean rise from ruin to glory. The broken country doesn't allow for clean anything. There was a night in July when a storm came through, one of those violent high-plains storms that stack up green-black in the afternoon and come apart over you with wind and hail and lightning that walks the ridgelands. I was home on my own place when it hit, and I thought about Ruth up there alone, and I'll admit I worried. I drove up the next morning to find her already out working, and I found out what the storm had done. Lightning had struck near the near paddock, and the bison had panicked. Buffalo will run through most any fence when they're truly scared, and they had, taking down a long stretch of the new wire she'd bled to put up. Half the herd had scattered up into the rough country to the north. And one of the yearlings had run in the dark straight into a washout and broken its leg so bad there was nothing to do but what she did, which was walk up to it in the gray dawn with her husband's rifle, and do the thing that had to be done, alone, and then sit down in the wet grass next to it and not get up for a while. She told me this flatly, standing by the down fence, dry-eyed. But her hands shook when she rolled her tobacco, and she couldn't get the paper to take. And after the third try, she crushed it in her fist and put it in her pocket and looked away at the hills. "You want help getting them back?" I asked. "I want help fixing the fence," she said. "The rest I'll do myself. They'll come back to the water. They always come back to the water." She finally looked at me and her eyes were terrible and steady. "It's not the losing one that's hard. Animals die. I've buried more animals than I can count. It's that I brought them here. I took them off that auction floor and I promised them." She stopped. "It sounds foolish." "It doesn't," I said. "I promised them a better life than the one they had, and that one didn't get it. That one got a broke leg in a washout in the dark in a strange country because I decided its life should be different." She shook her head hard once. "You take responsibility for a life, you take responsibility for all of what happens to it, the good and the bad both. People forget that. They want the good part only." We fixed the fence. It took 2 days. And the scattered bison did come back to the water, drifting down out of the rough country in 2s and 3s over the following week, until the herd was whole again but for the 2 she'd lost. The cow in the trailer back in April, and now the yearling. 38 head. 38 head and 100 acres greening up like something out of the old stories. And a woman who'd spent everything she had and half of what she was. And it was still only July, and the winter was still coming. The winter, everybody in the county was waiting for the winter. That was the thing they said now when they said anything. Let's see how she does come winter. Because summer's easy, relatively. Summer forgives a lot. It's winter in the broken country that separates the ranchers from the dreamers, that kills the weak stock and breaks the thin operations and sends the hobby folks packing back to town. Winter would be the test. And I found, driving home that July evening through grass moving like water in the wind, that I wanted her to pass it more than I'd wanted anything for myself in a long time. The winter came hard that year. I want you to understand that. It wasn't a mild winter that let her off easy. It was one of the bad ones, the kind we still measure other winters against. Snow by early November, a deep freeze that set in around Thanksgiving and never truly let go. Blizzards stacked up one behind another through January like train cars, and a stretch in February so cold the diesel gelled in the trucks, and the cattle died standing up on operations a lot bigger and better funded than Ruth Delgado's. I couldn't get up to her place for weeks at a time. The road was impassable. I'd call when the phone lines were up, and half the time they weren't. And I'd sit in my warm kitchen and look north toward the broken country and worry about an old woman and 38 bison the way I hadn't worried about anything since my wife took sick. I know that now. But I didn't know it then, and the not knowing was its own long, cold season. Here is the thing about bison that I learned that winter, that the whole county learned, that some of us are still a little ashamed we didn't know before. They are built for this. They were built for this before we ever showed up with our cattle and our hay and our worry. A cow in a blizzard turns her tail to the wind and drifts downwind till a fence or a draw stops her. And there she stands, and there, too often, she dies, because a cow doesn't have the sense or the equipment to do otherwise. A bison faces into the storm, faces into it. Lowers that great head and pushes forward through the wind instead of fleeing before it, and that massive front end, all that muscle and bone and thick matted hair, it's a snowplow, it's a furnace. It's 10,000 years of evolution that says this weather is my weather and I will walk through it. They swing those heads and sweep the snow off the grass, and they graze the frozen ground, and they do not need us. They never needed us. We just needed to believe they did. Ruth fed no hay that winter. This is the part that, when it got out, changed everything. Every cattleman in the county spent that brutal winter hauling hay through snow to keep his stock alive, going broke doing it, some of them watching their feed bills swallow whatever thin profit the year had promised. And up in the broken country, an old woman with no money and no help fed her 38 bison almost nothing at all, and they wintered on the land itself. On the grass her grazing had grown, sweeping the snow off it with their heads, and they came through that killer winter not just alive, but fat. Fat in March, when I finally got up that road again ahead of the melt, white-knuckling my truck over ice. I came over the last rise expecting God knows what. A disaster, a graveyard. And I saw 38 bison standing in the snow-patched pasture with their winter coats grown out thick as a bear's. And they were fat, they were glossy. They stood there breathing steam into the cold blue morning like they owned it, like winter was a thing that happened to other, lesser animals. And there were more of them than 38. I counted twice from the truck before I trusted it. Then I got out and counted again on my feet. 44 head. 6 calves, born in the worst of it in January and February, in weather that killed grown cattle, dropped by bison cows on the open ground with no barn and no help and no vet, and every one of them had lived. 6 new bison calves, red gold and leggy, tucked in among the herd, alive and thriving in a winter that had emptied the bank accounts and broken the hearts of every conventional rancher for 50 miles. Ruth came out of the house when she heard my truck. She was thinner than in the fall, and she moved like the winter had cost her something in the joints, and her face was gaunt. But she was standing. She'd made it through alone, and when she saw me looking at the calves, she came and stood beside me at the fence, and we didn't say anything for a long time. 6, I finally said. My voice wasn't quite steady. 6 so far, she said. There's 2 more cows look to calve here shortly. In this. They calved in this. This is nothing to them. She said it with such quiet pride I felt my throat tight. This is a Tuesday to them. Their grandmothers calved in worse, and their grandmothers before that, back and back and back, further than either of us can imagine. I didn't do this. She gestured at the fat, steaming, impossible animals. I just quit fighting what they already knew. That's all I ever did. I quit fighting it and I got out of the way. Word got out the way it does. It started with the vet, actually. Ruth had to call one finally in late March, when one of those last 2 cows had a hard calving, and even bison sometimes need a hand. The vet drove up that terrible road and did his work, and then he stood in Ruth Delgado's pasture and looked around him at what he was seeing, and being a man who'd spent that whole winter up to his shoulders in dying cattle across the county, he understood exactly what he was looking at. And he talked. Vets talk. It's how they are. By April, a full year near enough from the auction where we'd all laughed, Ruth Delgado's place had become something people needed to see with their own eyes. And they came. They came up that bad road in their good trucks, the same men who'd laughed, The county extension agent who'd spent 40 years telling ranchers to buy more feed and run more cattle. The big operators from the good land down in the valley, men with more acres and more money and more equipment than Ruth would see in 10 lifetimes. And they stood at her fence in the spring mud, and they looked at her fat, healthy herd and her 44 head grown from 38 grown from a starving lot she'd stolen for $800. And they looked at her grass, coming up green and thick and native, bunchgrass waving in the spring wind on land everybody had written off as ruined. And something changed in their faces. I watched it change. I was there for a lot of it because by then I suppose I'd become something like Ruth's friend, and I stood at the fence beside her while the county came to look. And then came the part that still, when I think about it, does something to me I don't have good words for. They started asking to buy her calves. Because here's what those men understood, standing in that pasture, that they hadn't understood a year before. Those bison calves were worth something now. Not for meat, though there was that. They were worth something as breeding stock, as the start of a man's own herd, the seed of the thing they'd all just watched survive the winter that broke them. Every rancher who'd watched his cattle die and his feed bills bury him that winter was standing in Ruth's pasture doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said, what if I'd had those instead? The same men who'd said somebody ought to put 'em down. The same men who'd laughed at the crazy woman and her 40 ways to lose $800. They came, hat in hand, up that bad road, and they asked Ruth Delgado if they could please buy her calves. Some of them offered real money. One of the big valley operators offered her a figure for the 6 calves that was more than her whole ranch had cleared in the best 5 years her husband ever had. I was standing right there for that one. I watched Ruth's face while the man made his offer. He was a decent enough fellow, I'll say that, not gloating, genuinely humbled by what he'd seen. He named his figure and he waited. And Ruth was quiet a while. She looked out at her herd, at the 6 calves, at the 2 new ones even now finding their legs in the wet grass. Then she looked at that valley rancher, and I want to tell you exactly what she said, because I've never forgotten it. You want to buy the calves, she said, but you don't want what made the calves, you want the 6 animals. You don't want the 10 years of standing back and the busted knuckles and the winter alone and the ones I buried and the getting out of the way. You want the result without the surrender. She shook her head, not unkindly. The calves aren't for sale, but I'll tell you what is. If you want to bring your own land back the way this land came back, if you're willing to do the whole hard thing and not just buy the easy end of it, then come back in the fall and bring a chair, and I'll teach you everything I know for free. That's the only price. You have to be willing to learn to stand back. And most of you, she said, gently looking around at all of them, would rather write a check than learn that. So we'll see who comes back in the fall. I don't know how to end this the way you'd want a story ended, tied off neat. Life up in the broken country doesn't tie off neat, and I'd be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. Some of them came back in the fall. Not all, not even most. The big valley operator didn't. He bought Bison from somebody else, a big operation out of state, trucked them in like equipment, and I heard it didn't go well for him because he never did learn the part about standing back. He ran them like cattle and got cattle results and gave up inside 2 years and went back to what he knew. He wanted the calves. He never wanted what made the calves. Ruth had seen that in him at a glance. But a handful came back with chairs, like she'd said. Younger ones, mostly. A few of the ones who'd lost the most that winter and had the least left to protect and so, maybe, the most room left to change. And Ruth taught them, sitting on her porch through that next winter and the ones after, and some of them took it up and brought their own hard country back to life, slow, the way it has to be done. There are pieces of this county today, green and deep-rooted and full of bison and birdsong, that trace straight back to that woman and her $800 gamble, and most people driving past don't know it, and Ruth would have preferred it that way. She's gone now, I'll tell you that because you'd wonder. She lived another 11 years after that first winter, ran her herd up to near 100 head, brought her whole 200 acres back to something her grandmother's people might have recognized, and she died in her own bed in her own house on her own healed land, which is more than her husband got and more than most of us will get. I was there near the end. She wasn't afraid. People who have made their peace with standing back, I've noticed, they don't fear the last standing back either. I asked her once, toward the end, whether it had been worth it. All of it. The winter alone, the ones she buried, the 11 years of the hardest work I ever watched a human being do. She thought about it a long while. Outside the window her herd was grazing in the good grass. dark shapes moving slow across the green, the way they'd moved across that country for 10,000 years before either of us was born and would, God willing, move across it for 10,000 more. I didn't save the land, she said finally. I want you to get that right when you tell it. The land saved itself. The buffalo saved it. I just stopped standing in the way and paid attention and did what the paying attention told me to do. She smiled, that young smile, one last time. That's the whole secret, and nobody wants it because it means the answer was never about how strong you are. It's about how still you can get, how much you're willing to not know, how long you can stand back and let something wiser than you do the work. I've thought about that every day since. I'm an old man now myself. I run Bison on my own place. Did I mention that? I do. Started the fall after that first winter with 2 calves Ruth gave me for nothing because I was one of the ones who came back with a chair. Some evenings I stand at my fence and watch them move across grass that gets a little deeper every year. And I think about a woman at an auction rail with her chin on her folded hands, looking at 40 starving animals the way you'd look at something you already loved.